All right, so this week we're going to start talking about dependent versus independent variables in math. Now, you might have heard these terms a lot before in science, so we're going to talk a little bit about how do they actually relate to kind of numbers and tables and graphs in math situations. So our learning target is that we can identify dependent and independent variables by today reading through a situation. So today I'm going to give you guys a lot of different situations, and you're just going to have to identify which is the independent variable and which one's the dependent variable. So we'll start with some definitions. So let's look at some definitions here. Obviously, our first one is an independent variable, and that's the quantity that's being changed or manipulated in a situation. And then the dependent variable is the quantity whose value depends on the independent variable. So you might have seen these words in science class before, or maybe even in math class, but it might be worth taking notes and writing these down in a notebook or on a piece of paper so that you can refer to them when you're doing your assignment later today and later throughout the week. So let me just share with you also some other ways that we would describe these types of variables. So independent variable, you can kind of think of this as the manipulated amount, right? I have this word manipulated up in the definition there. I also like to think of it as the starting quantity. So in a situation, what are we starting with? We could also think of it as the input, which we've talked about input-output tables earlier in the year, usually with X's and Y's. So we'll get to that later in the week. Some other names for dependent variables are the responding amount or the ending quantity or the output. So see how these kind of match up with the independent variable names. So a manipulated amount for the independent variable, we're going to manipulate something and that results in some amount that's responding to what we manipulate, right? Or we start with some quantity and then we do something and then we end up with a different quantity. Or we put something into a situation and we get something out of a situation. So let me show you some examples. So the first example is pretty basic situation. You notice that the warmer it is outside, the more water you drink. So notice that there are no numbers in this situation, right? I'm not asking you to kind of identify like the input and the output numbers or anything like that. We're just kind of talking about what amount or what kind of situation are we starting with, and then what are we ending up with, or what's the thing that depends on something else. So you'll notice that when it says the more water you drink, right? How much water you drink depends on how warm it is outside. So if you could rephrase it as if blank then blank, or if this depends on this, right? The thing that it's depending on is the independent variable, right? It's kind of doing its own thing. So we know that temperature or how warm it is outside is kind of independent of anything, right? We don't control that. It's just kind of doing its own thing. The warmer it is outside, the more water we drink. Well, if it gets really, really warm outside, then we are going to drink a lot of water, right? Hear that if then statement. If it's warm outside, then I'm going to drink a lot of water. So that's the dependent variable. The amount of water that you drink depends on temperature. Okay, so the second example is that you're baking cupcakes to sell for $1 at a bake sale at school. So we want to kind of think about, could we rephrase this in an if then kind of sentence, or can I say this depends on this? Well, I can think, okay, I'm baking cupcakes, I want to sell them at school. So if I bake cupcakes, right, it kind of sounds like we're starting with baking cupcakes, then what happens? Well, then it sounds like hopefully I'm going to sell them. And so what happens if I sell cupcakes? Well, hopefully I'm going to make some money. So the independent variable is how many cupcakes I make, right? That's what I have to start with. If I don't bake any cupcakes, I'm for sure not going to make any money. And then the dependent variable is actually just going to be how much money do you earn, right? If you bake one cupcake, let's assume that we sell them all. If I bake one cupcake, the maximum I'm going to make is $1. If I make 100 cupcakes, I could make $100, right? If I make 1,000 cupcakes, I'm not going to have any flour left, but I could make $1,000 on that, right? So the amount of money I earn is going to depend on the cupcakes I make. So finally, Mario decides to go for a drive with Luigi, and for every 25 miles they drive, they burn 1 gallon of gas. So let's think about this. What's the independent and what's the dependent variable? So let's think if we could phrase this in an if-then statement. So I'm kind of thinking if they drive for a really long time, then they're going to burn a lot of gas, right? Or in other words, the amount of gas that they burn depends on the 25 miles that they drive. So I would say that the independent variable is the miles that they drive, right? If they drive a lot of miles, then they're going to burn a lot of gas. If they don't drive a lot of miles, they're not going to burn a lot of gas. So the dependent variable is how much gas they have left in their tank. So the gas they have depends on how many miles they drive. So go back to Teams or go back to your Microsoft form where you were and fill out the lesson one form. And that just has a few examples where you need to decide which one's the independent variable and which one's the dependent variable.